On this episode of A State of Control, we continue our discussions that we've been having on recent episodes about how the industry is adapting to the supply chain and chip shortages. We've talked about virtual control, we've talked about testing new products, and now we get into looking at new control platforms. All that and more on A State of Control.
The network for the AV industry.
What are you listening to?
This
is AV.
This
is AVNation.
This is AVNation.
A State of Control.
A State of Control, episode 98. AV on CNN.
Support for AVNation is brought to you by Crestron.
Welcome to A State of Control, an AVNation podcast that highlights the control, programming, and automation aspects of the audiovisual industry. I'm your host, Steve Greenblatt, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. On today's show, we're going to continue our conversation that we've been having over the past couple episodes where we've talked about the impact of the product shortages, supply chain, and so forth that have really made a big difference, both positively and I think and negatively in the AV industry. And we're talking now in the year 2022. So in case you're listening to this in the future, you know some perspective. But it certainly had a big impact. And we've done several episodes in the past series this year talking about this from different angles. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce a couple of our guests. One is returning and one is a newcomer. And before we get there, I'd like to say hi to my partner here at A State of Control, and his name is Rich Fregosa, and he goes by Uncle Richie. How are you today, Rich?
I'm doing great. Mellow West Coast greetings, and as we are marching on the path to episode 100, so.
That's right. Dangerously close. So I wonder what we have in store for that.
We're just going to call that one Chef's Kiss, the Chef's Kiss episode. So.
It's been a lot of years in the making. So we've been it's probably about 8 or so years if we're doing 12 a year. So, like to welcome back our first guest. He is Mike Krejci, and he's from CTI. Hey, Mike, how are you?
I'm doing great, Steve. It's always good to talk to you and Uncle Richie and get to share our knowledge and what we're doing around.
Thanks. And the last time we had Mike on, we were actually in person at Infocom, and that was really cool. And we had some of our conversation then also pertained to this topic, so it's a great tie-in. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome a newcomer to this show, but somebody who has been on the IT Factor. If you've listened to that podcast, it's one that is of similar content. And his name is Colin Birney, and he is from AVMSP. Welcome, Colin.
Thank you, Steve, and everyone else. I appreciate being here. I'm excited. I hope for the 100th episode, you have all of your previous guests on all at once, and they all get 10 seconds to talk. It'll be a 4-hour episode.
I think that would be very cool, and maybe that's something we'll have to throw into the mix. But
a battle royale, you could do a bracket down to find out who the best guest of the past 100 episodes was.
There you go. So as I mentioned at the top, a lot of companies, a lot of clients, integrators, programmers are all facing a lot of change. It's probably a good common theme in this year, and a lot of it is not necessarily change that was predictable or change that is something that is that warranted or wanted, preferred, let's say. But we all have to change to grow, and and sometimes it's good to be opening our eyes to new ways of doing things, new products. And today we're going to talk a little bit about what to look at when you're working with a new control platform. So, Rich, I say this a lot, but you and I have been around doing this for some time. And of course, we have our favorites. And a lot of times those come from the experiences that we've had and just our knowledge and expertise. When you're doing something for a long time, you get good at it and you get comfortable. But what happens when you have to change and look at a new platform? And is this something that is an easy, can you offer some insight, let's say, for somebody who has to go down that road?
A big part of it is that prior to, the dreaded use of the word supply chain, it was really easy to kind of dig your heels in and determine that you were going to be in one specific camp, and that's the way it's always been, and that's the way it's always going to be. And when there were delays or there was a product shortage or, X, Y, or Z or a new model, you were dealing with what people would expect as reasonable delays. A couple of weeks, a 30-day cycle, a 60-day cycle, maybe a 90-day cycle, right? Or maybe you got caught in between model years of a device and you're like, well, you can go ahead and use X, but we do know that the new generation of Y is coming. So, maybe let's design for Y. And when it gets here, which we know will happen within a calendar year, then we'll deploy that way. And that's just the way it always has been in the electronics industry. You knew something new was going to come along. It just depends on now. Well, it was prior to that. It just depended on what market you were in, which would be your turnover rate. Residential, because you were dealing with consumer electronics, you got a faster burn rate or return rate. You move into commercial and, huddle spaces or boardrooms, that has one. You then start moving into education, longer cycle ranges. Then you start moving into government, way longer cycle ranges. So that was just the way that it's been done for 30 years, give or take. You would worry about the newest slide projector, the newest overhead projector, the newest video projector, and, the newest touch display. Now, because we are so software driven, the speed of software driven services makes it impossible to provide hardware excuses. And that's the biggest thing right now for integrators, for programmers, for anybody in there, is that you have to embrace the speed of the software world. And the speed of the software world, they talk about, fail fast, fail often. That's really not what we were taught going in. We were taught measure 4 times, and cut once. So, it is a completely different way of having to embrace your market and your product cycle and really your approach to the business. But I think it's good. I think it forced us to stop relying on bad habits. We wouldn't look at something that maybe was better for the situation just because we had long-standing habits, right? I've got a framework of 10 years of stuff that I've done. So why should I look at something new when the stuff I've been doing for 10 years still works and all I basically got to do is just to save as? That's pretty compelling, from a workflow standpoint. That may not have been what was best for the project, but it was what was the most convenient for us. So I think that this is an opportunity to expand your tool belt and also be able to provide more finely tuned solutions for your clients.
Mike, I'll pitch in on this same point. A lot of times you get good at what you practice. So in order to really feel comfortable with something, you need to get some time in, but it's also probably not advisable to do that on basically at the client's expense, let's say. So when you're looking at what are your options? Can you offer any insight as to either how you go about evaluating something new, or maybe even have a strategy for doing this as in terms of preparing in advance for needing to make a change?
Absolutely. So as a fairly large integrator, when we think about going to a new product, a new platform, a new anything, there is a learning curve. A new mount, there's a learning curve, right? And it's not just of the programmer, it's not just of the installer, it's the engineers, it's the salespeople, it's breaking all departments of those habits in learning the product. There's part numbers that every one of us can name without even thinking about it. What's your favorite switcher? You know the model of it without even blinking. So it's breaking that habit, figuring out the quirks of each product, what we need to do special for that one, and how can we do it. And there's a cost to that. There's a time to that on how to, learn those quirks, figure them out, so we can deploy them properly for the customer. And we don't want to do it there on their site, right? We need to do that before we ever go out and put that product on site and go, well, I've never touched this before. That doesn't put a whole lot of confidence in your integration team when you go, oh, this is the first time I've touched it. So we've got to do that beforehand. And so when we decide on a new product as a company, it's a very strategic decision that we're making based on the relationship with that manufacturer, with that supplier. There's a group of people that all put their input in. Is this the right product technology wise? What does it take extra or less to do what we need it to do? Can we control it? That's the first question my CTO asked me for any product before he greenlights it. Can we control it? If I say no, it doesn't go. It immediately gets stopped and redlined. Okay, how do we solve that? Can we solve it, or do we just need to move on to the next thing?
Colin, I bring you into this because I think Mike brings up a lot of good points, and I think I love the idea that we're talking about. Can you control it in the beginning? Because a lot of times that's the last thing that you do. We're typically in the business of making things work together, and that becomes a lot of times the responsibility of the service provider when we're working with something new. That challenge somehow falls to the person who is the lowest in the chain, which a lot of times is the programmer. From your perspective, and I know that you do a lot of support of systems. What advice can you provide that would kind of set people up so that the expectations would be proper when we're looking at implementing something new?
Oh boy, that's a super loaded question right now, because if you follow where customers are, especially from a security standpoint, I mean we are directly in the crosshairs of the zero trust model. We're considered IoT. We're not considered nice to have around or be on a network. And as you get into things like cloud control and all that, you're like, oh, cool. So you're going to tunnel into my network and leave a door open and historically have not had a really strong success, a strong structure around security. It's like, well, we put a network port on it. I don't know. And, there's some very almost surprisingly archaic exploits that can get into AV gear because it just hasn't been held up to the standards. And I think that, like, kind of going back to what Rich was talking about with, if I can tangent slightly, what Rich was talking about with supply chain, the issue that AV has is that we don't operate on standard sets of hardware. I can't pull a Dell server, throw it in, and then AV suddenly happens. It's happening on devices that have custom chipsets. They have old Windows builds. There's a few manufacturers that are still running bizarre locked Windows builds that you can't update or patch. And that's just a huge problem. And so I think from a programming perspective, and even from an implementation perspective, getting in the point of saying, okay, yeah, I need to be able to control it, but do I need to be able to monitor it? Do I need to actually have access to it? Because you can still create control systems in a air-gapped environment, and that's fine. And you can sort of pen them in a way that where, yeah, they can access the internet, but they can't. But I think that's going to really probably fall on the programmer to have those serious conversations with the IT organization. Say, okay, hey, this is new technology. How do we protect you? How do we protect us? Because I don't know about you all in your businesses, but right now, my insurance agent says you have to carry cybersecurity insurance. If you touch anything on a network, you do not want to get sued out of existence for being the person that hired a contractor that opened up a data breach. It's become an insurance issue, not really a, like, it's not really it's a problem, but it's a financial problem now. It's just, they happen, the incidents happen, you sue your way down the line, everyone needs to be insured. And so doing your due diligence and making sure that you have had the sign off with the IT groups, that's going to be the biggest thing. Because I think, there is an extent of learning new code, learning new hardware, learning how new, physical architecture works. But I think the biggest thing is making sure that you have partnership with your customers and with their security providers and with their network people, because that's going to be the easiest way to get shown the door and to lose credibility and to say, hey, this industry is dangerous, or this group is dangerous, or something like that. It's like, and you don't want to get marked as the one who had a data breach, because that's a quick way to cut off a large chunk of business flow. I see your face, Mike. That weighs on me all the time. Like, anytime I say, hey, I've got a little box that I can put on your network that monitors things, I like it because I can monitor things, but it also, there's a little trickle of sweat that comes down my face thinking about how much do I trust the company that I'm using, that they are secure on their side. Because that's the thing. It's like, you're writing the code, but you're trusting that manufacturers are in there. And that's a big thing of, like, how well do you trust your manufacturers, and do they have a history of being on the front end of security? And that's kind of the big question when we're talking about new.
And I want to jump in here real quick, Colin. I think one of the things that scares me at night is not necessarily my company, my team causing that leak, but it's any one of our AV products or manufacturers on somebody else's job site, on some other client having that leak, right? We all look, Target that hit the news however many years ago because of, a remote access computer for an HVAC system. It's a matter of time before AV is on CNN, right? And, whatever manufacturer, whatever part, whatever integrator, whether it's some mom and pop shop in the middle of nowhere, whether it's one of the big guys somewhere, it's gonna be, right? It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, that it's there, right? And that's the part that scares me, because it's gonna make all of our jobs harder that day, right? Probably for the better in the long term, but that day when it happens, it is going to make all of our lives very difficult, because now we're already on, we're already having to secure this stuff. But when they go, oh, this happened there, you guys can't even beat. You guys got to build up your own network. You need to provide your own internet connection. It's gonna be a horrible time, and it's coming. It's got to.
And that's the day. I think that's the day when we start just doing what IoT does, and we throw a SIM card holder into every piece of gear and say, well, we're sitting, physically in your space, but 100% outside of your network, and we're going to deal with the consequences of things as they happen. I think too, Mike, the thing that, I'm not going to name names, and this stuff easy enough to find, but there have been instances where, you talk about hardware. We're in this weird space where no one really makes their own hardware. To a certain extent, people do, but there's components that it goes from, hey, I put my label on this and sold it, to maybe I have, part of the panel, but I've added some proprietary things or whatever. There's a popular, wireless screen sharing product that got licensed to everyone under the sun. And a security group picked up on it because there was just a huge number of exploits that were available if you happen to have it sitting publicly, which a lot of universities and guest environments were doing. And what they found was that when this product got licensed out, there was no path to patch it. So even if you wanted to patch it, no one knew how. And then we also had an issue where half the companies that had made it weren't even in existence anymore. So these small companies that spun up to sell this device that was competing with, every other version of it, they quickly folded because it wasn't viable, and then they moved on, and that's just it. It's gone and it's dead. And the original manufacturer had no responsibility to actually push patches down. And so I think that's part of when we talk about partnerships, and especially when I'm advising clients, it's like, know who you're going into, a relationship with, because if you pick manufacturers that have, shown to be responsive and have a comprehensive, like, over-the-air patch method, you have a better chance of, like you said, something's going to happen. It's not an if, it's a when, but it's the response that matters. And there are varying degrees of comfort I have with some manufacturers as to whether they would respond properly or respond quickly, or whether they could even respond at all. They probably might go, well, we need to call the person who actually made it and ask them why there's a gaping hole in the architecture because we just put our logo on it. Sorry. And that's unfortunately still something that's happening in the industry.
Rich, I'll have you kind of jump in because I think that this is a really good conversation that we wasn't necessarily thinking about. But when it comes to something like this, as Colin mentioned, is it the manufacturer's responsibility to kind of sell themselves and make everybody feel comfortable with what they're providing, including the clients, or is it more of our responsibility to be selective in saying this is what this is a viable product that we should be considering, if we are going to be making a change or using something new?
It always comes down to how much you believe the manufacturer is going to be loyal to you over the long term. There are lots of manufacturers that have lots of great marketing sound bites and press releases that talks about dealer loyalty and support and ... And I there's a well-known saying I have about dealing with manufacturers that I can't really talk about on this podcast. But it has to do with how much you give towards them and how much they give back towards you. It has to come down to, if it's a consultant spec, at that point, that was the consultant's due diligence, right? That's why they were hired, theoretically, to be able to go down all of those paths and provide the recommendations on X, Y, or Z. And it should have been at that point an educated decision. So if you're being handed something on spec to deploy, as an integrator, is that on you to make sure that the manufacturer is following through? No, technically it isn't. At that point, you should have, in your agreement, that everything that you're doing is based on the specification that you were given, and all issues and changes or discrepancies should be referred back to the designing partner. It's been, again, I work with consultants a lot. I am a consultant. I write the spec. It's easy to write in your spec that your system is 95% complete and the last 5% is somebody else's problem. And you can see specs like that are out there that go, yeah, we think it's good, but, until it gets out there. So as an integrator, or as a programming firm or somebody who's been awarded the contract who wasn't necessarily responsible for it in the beginning, part of it is protection. Part of it is advocating for the client as much as you can. But at the same time, there is a chain of command. Now, if you're, design build, if you are the primary liaison to the client and you are their SME, you are their subject matter expert, then absolutely it is your responsibility to say, here are the options, here's my recommendations, and if you want to make a decision where you feel that you can afford to be optimistic, then I need to explain to you the ramifications. I deal with this a lot in Resi, and especially in high-end Resi and bespoke, because the issue that you have in Resi is really the bellwether that happens every place else from a cybersecurity standpoint, which is that you have somebody who is fixated on the convenience factor. And I always tell this to clients, the whole purpose about security is it needs to be difficult to make it secure. Secure and easy do not go together. I don't care how much you wish it would be, but we haven't figured out the omnipotent mind-reading system out there yet. So because of that, we are building fail-safes in to protect you. I am protecting you from yourself. And, my first meeting that I typically have with clients is, My job is to tell you no. My job is to tell you the things that you're going to get mad at me for, and then hopefully I'm going to explain it to you in a way that you're going to understand why I'm protecting you for this. Because you're going to be a lot more upset if something bad happens and I didn't tell you, because then that's on me, because I didn't educate you on the risk factor. So, it does come down to risk. And it really does depend on the project where the risk is going to be assessed. And absolutely what Colin was talking about. The minute that you touch anything on a network, whether directly or indirectly, you are creating a point of exposure. And you need to think about that, because no longer do we just have analog signals where it stops and ends, right? You don't have just a fuzzy image, or you don't have crackling over the pots, right? You have, depending on what you're dealing with, the SEC, DOD, HIPAA, it's much more than just, I can't get this projector to turn on and off. And we don't tend to downplay it, but I feel that the manufacturers tend to downplay it more often than not, because it then has to point back at them where their flaws may be, and they don't like pointing out their flaws. It's our job to call them an ugly baby sometimes, and they don't like it when we tell them that their baby's ugly, but sometimes you got to do it.
Have you had the experience with customers where, by and large, like I know Resi's a little different, but in corporate, I don't know that I'm not saying like customers don't care that there's a difference between the consultant, the integrator, and the manufacturer, but I feel like a lot of times in their mind, they lump it all together, and when you say, hey, there's an issue, and start pointing fingers internally, they go, I don't care. This is AV world. You're all the same to me. You're all in the same ball, and you need to fix it. And that's where that's where it makes me nervous, is that you as a consultant, me as a consultant, we can do our best due diligence, but I can explain as much as I can, but there's still, I feel like at our level there's still a lot of due diligence just to protect ourselves from manufacturers and integrators and programmers and all of that, from that sort of getting sort of dragged down into the same ball of blame.
It for me, it's always come down to who you partner with. If I can't trust my partners to be able to work something out with me, because again, I always, when I work with partners, I always tell them, I hope the mistake is mine. I truly hope the mistake is mine, because if I made the mistake, I can fix it. When you are dealing in a collaborative situation with the team, esprit de corps to me is really that most important part. I need to be able to rely on that person to come to me truthfully and work. Otherwise, and I talk to integrators about this a lot, like when they see a big project and the first thing they see is just like dollar signs. I'm like, this could be a company killer very quickly if you don't step aside and take a look at not what you may make on this project, but if things go south, what they could cost you on this project. It's never what you make, it's what you walk away with. And so, that is something that I feel that comes with maturity as a company, comes with maturity as being in the industry, is that, you put your hand on the fire so many times, sooner or later you go, that's hot, I shouldn't do that anymore. But it is the gripe that is as old as this industry. Since, before Avixa was Avixa, and before Infocom was Infocom, and we had all kinds of different acronyms, and we were still dealing with slide projectors and pneumatic tubes to send messages back and forth. It's the industry old gripe that's going on. And I don't know how again, like I said, it's if you want to eat, you got to make sure that you plan before you even take on that project. And that's where it starts. It starts with is even saying yes or no to the project. Because sometimes you just have to step away, because this is lose-lose.
Yeah, and I think that that kind of goes back to what Mike was saying too, getting back to programming and new products. There is a security side, there is a failure side, but I think there is a lot of it doesn't matter how experienced you are, if there comes a time where you need to learn a new language or learn a new system, making sure that there's we all have to be entry level at some point when new technology comes out. No one can say, yeah, I've got 10 years of experience in a product that came out yesterday. Doesn't happen. But they're, recognizing a history of that change is important. I think the other thing, Rich, where I try to push customers is, I'm very tired of I have a new building, design build, portioned out part of things. And what I've worked with on a lot of customers is implementing sort of the product manager role within either a consultancy or within the customer to say, hey, before we, even if we're not planning to build any rooms in the near future, or we do have something coming up, let's work that out individually, because prototyping works these things out well before you have to design it. So if I, the customer, have engaged with a consultant, manufacturers, and an integrator to actually prototype rooms and prototype new technology and say, hey, we've hammered on this and we've busted it. We've all agreed that this meets the security requirements that we have. Then when you move into the larger design build, you've made key decisions along the way. Yeah, TVs don't matter. Pick a TV, who cares? Pick a projector, who cares? But when it gets to control systems, to network, to monitoring and things like that, taking a step back and saying, hey, let's move this into a prototype environment where we can expose ourselves to extreme risk and not pay the consequences, and we can test out and say, hey, do you actually know how to program this? I think a lot of customers, if that's proposed to them, because I've worked with a number of companies on that, where they now have a product catalog of things that they go through rigorous design on, and it changes on a calendar cycle, not on a per project cycle. And so they say, hey, we have version 2 of our small conference room and it's out, and it allows them to address that. I think that's a more modern way to go forward, and it also mitigates that risk because you've already taken that partnership and you've done some vetting and you've done some risk assessment in a safe space where you cannot, you're not throwing 500 rooms into a building.
Well, I think that falls under advocacy because again, that's a perfect world. Again, from a consultant
absolutely.
and the biggest point, and Steve, I'm gonna kind of toot both of their horns right now. One of the things that Steve and Mark Lebecchia did that was really great was that they spent a good chunk of time focusing on how you should foster your relationships with technology managers for that reason, because that's a line item expense that if it goes to somebody who is on the CFO side, they goes, why are we spending money on this? It should just work, right? And that's immediately the first thing that gets redlined through, right? Because you don't have somebody championing for you. We could champion all we want, but if there's no value proposition on the other side, it becomes a tough sell. Now, from a consultancy standpoint, should you be doing that from an advocacy, which, again, you quarantine and you got your own skunk works and all of those things? Yeah, we spec it. We've got, I'm fortunate to be in the Silicon Valley, and, I'm dealing with a lot of biotech and tech companies and stuff. And so, yeah, absolutely. They embrace that. They embrace, that skunk word side of things. But there's still 49 other states in the country that you don't necessarily have that same technology advocacy necessarily. And one of the things that I really admire about CTI and it, I think, has contributed to their huge growth in the past 5 years is the way that their teams work together, because they do operate that way in terms of the programming, the field, the design, the management, the accounting side of things, right? They are, if people watching this or listening to this haven't had an opportunity to kind of follow CTI and what they're doing, you should, because they're really becoming a model in the industry of stuff that is just working. And again, it's like nothing shows that you're doing it right than success, right, and growth. And a big part of it, is the lessons. I kind of see, with the communication, the collaboration, which is they're not believing their own press, right? They're just going in and it's just getting the job done. Steve and the things that he's done with his other shows in his company as well has become a matter of, yes, you've got to advocate, but the only way that the advocating is going to take that next step is if everybody else joins in and goes, yeah, I'm going to deal with the inconvenient stuff too. It's just kind of industry wide, where whether there isn't secret sauce, but we've still got every company out there thinking they've got secret sauce. And that's what winds up causing the biggest problem. Even with consultants, right? Every consultant comes in badgering the other one or bad-mouthing the other one because, oh, their secret sauce doesn't work here because we did this. And it's the same stuff. Like you said, a TV's a TV, a projector's a projector, this stuff. But even that is a matter of, hey, by the way, did you know that this manufacturer, even though we tell them not to push firmware updates, just blanket pushed stuff out last night, and now we've got 600 TVs that are all stuck on a screen? Oh, that's a problem. Yeah, we know. Yeah, but they were $64 cheaper. Well, what did that $64 gain you, right? Those are... It's interesting because, again, I bridge both worlds. I've got the luxury of bridging both worlds, of being with demanding people in their own personal space and demanding people in their workspace. And the psychology is the same, is that, you don't want to bite the hand that feeds you, but you have to protect the hand that feeds you. And in this current state right now, when you don't got no product, you got to sell whatever you can and do whatever job you can to keep your doors open. And it's also a very volatile time, for integrators, right? Some are just taking on jobs because there's no other work out there. So, it's not perfect.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people are taking on jobs that are, I think there's a lot of reward out there, but they're also probably taking on risk that they normally wouldn't. And that's a concern. I mean, that being able to say no to work is, I don't think that's in the vocabulary of integrators. But I think there needs to be a no at some point, because if a customer says, hey, we need you to write some software that does this, you go, we don't do that. I'm sorry. We don't.
I don't want to curb a good conversation, but we are coming up on time. I wanted to kind of give Mike an opportunity to step in, and whether you want to comment on what was previously said, or also talk about maybe how to foster that collaboration, because it's not only collaboration amongst a company, but also partners and manufacturers as well.
First, I'll second what Krejci said, that we are doing it right here at CTI. Second is, I think, as Colin was saying, that being able to mock up the systems and test them out, that's key, right? Is this going to work in a solution for a customer? Is it going to work in a solution for every customer? And working that out is really key to finding the right solutions. And here at us, we're busy. There are products that are shipping. There's lots. If you can find them, there are products that are shipping from lots of manufacturers, and we've got a team that's looking for them and focusing on, instead of what can't we get and what can't we do, what can we do? And that's kind of driving us, and we're putting our effort is, okay, we can get this product. It's a little bit different than we've used before. Let's see if we can fit it in. Let's test it. Let's test it in shop. Does it work? Let's test it on one or two jobs. After it works on one or two jobs, let's open the gates a little bit more. Let's open the gates a little more. And then we take that and we communicate it down to the team. And like Rich said, we do communicate, amongst all of our offices. So, we don't have 50 salespeople across the country. What's the flavor of the week? What guy came and bought me lunch this week? That's the product I'm going to use. It's a real true vetting process to figure out, what can we do successfully, not necessarily, it doesn't have to be the cheapest. It doesn't have to be the flashiest. It doesn't have to be, one of the manufacturers that has the biggest booth at Infocom. What actually works and what can we do? And ultimately remembering, it's not about us. It's not about us as programmers, and ultimately about the end user experience. That's what we're delivering as programmers is, what is the user interfacing with? Whether that's a panel, a keypad, a cable, or an automation, right? They walk into the room. That's ultimately what we're dealing with is the end users, whether or not that's direct relationship, but that's where we're serving is them, and how can we keep doing that with those newer technologies, those newer products?
I think that's a great way of wrapping this one up, and I'm sure that we're going to keep come back to this conversation again. But thank you for that, and I want to be respectful of time. I appreciate such a lively conversation, and as we always say, the ones that are you hear the host the least, you probably the best podcast. So this is an indication of one of those. Mike Krejci from CTI, thanks for being with us today. How can people get in touch with you, learn more about what you're up to and what CTI is up to?
The pleasure's all mine, as always, Steve. You can find us at cti.com. You can find me on any of the socials at the Mike Krejci. That's where you can find us.
Excellent. Thank you. And Colin Birney from AVMSP, how can people get in touch with you and learn more about your company?
You can find me on the web at av-msp.com. Twitter's at avmanaged, and then my active contentious Twitter account is at Birney Consult. So look for me to be starting fights with the AV world there. But any of those, you'll find a way to contact me, and happy to talk. Always happy to talk.
I wouldn't consider them fights. You're making good conversation, and sometimes making sure that we're challenging a bit of a closed-minded thought. So
you don't see my DMs, Steve. That's the problem.
Fair enough. Well,
one day you'll be on the receiving end of one of my DMs. And
if you do want to see Colin more, you can also catch him on AV in the AM, which is how we also are in touch more regularly, and that's on Sunday mornings, hosted by our friend Chris Netto. And last but not least, Rich, another good episode and another great conversation. And I think that we had a few takeaways. If you want to share any closing thoughts or let people know how to reach you.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest takeaway that I have is the one that I always walk away with from these shows, which is these guys have great info and great knowledge, and that you need to rewind and listen if you didn't catch it the first time. Kind of fast forward through my stuff because it's just, the Uncle Richie Fireside Chat as usual. But a big part of it is that, especially now, and, Colin, I talked about it before, which is, it is that danger of saying yes to work that you shouldn't be taking on. Help your company grow, help your company survive, help your company thrive. And it comes from following patterning yourselves after the companies that are doing it right, the CTIs and, Colin's Consulting and your company and all of that. And so, I as I get older, I am happier embracing that I know less. So I am far more happier listening to these gentlemen at this point. But if you do want to follow any of my musings, you can find me on the interwebs at rFregosa, the Twitter, Fregosa Designs, the company. But first and foremost, as I always say, I hope the place that you find me is here on AVNation.tv and our suite of shows and all of our verticals, especially here with my partner, Steve. But that's about it.
And if you haven't already, you can check out a recent episode of Resi Week that Rich hosted. So that was always a treat and something that I enjoy. So please check that out. Visit avnation.tv, as Rich said, thank the sponsors, the supporters who helped to make this program and all the others possible. Also, if you wouldn't mind sharing your favorite episode, sending us some feedback, leaving a rating, review, and letting us know what you think. This episode hopefully got some juices flowing, and we'd love to hear some feedback and some continue the conversation. And as we count down to our 100th episode, we also want you to tune into that as well. So this is a precursor to that. For me, you can reach me at Steve Greenblatt on social media, and you could also visit my company, Control Concepts, at controlconcepts.net. I do some writing in several places and hang out on AV in the AM, as I mentioned. And I also host another podcast that is adjacent to this called Ask the Programmer with James King. And if you would check that out, I'd appreciate it. And this has been another great episode, and thank you for joining us on A State of Control.